Hey everybody, welcome back. Or rather, as I should say, welcome to section 3. In this section, we're going to be covering basic CRUD and a little bit of aggregation commands in the Mongo shell. And before we get started with that, I wanted to take a quick timeout and do an introduction video to explain to you just a little bit about the CRUD operations in general and the Mongo shell in particular. Now, throughout this video, we've been using the Mongo shell, and in the previous sections, we also used the Mongo shell, but I've never sat down with you to talk to you about it. And that's what I'm going to do in this video. But first, we're going to talk about CRUD. But in the database world, it's actually an acronym that stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. So when I'm telling my boss, what I'm doing this week, I tell him I'm working on CRUD options within the database. He knows exactly what I mean. So again, create applies to creating records as well as databases. Read handles operations where data is accessed from the database storage, of course. Update changes the existing records by either adding schema or dropping schema, or by adding or dropping data, or by changing the existing data. And then delete applies to the records within a collection that can be deleted. It also applies to the collections that can be deleted. And it applies to the databases that hold the collections. So CRUD, in terms of an acronym, covers basically pretty much everything you can do with a database, and we can do all of that from within the Mongo shell. Now, the interface, the Mongo shell is basically an interface in interactive JavaScript to Mongo database itself. It's included with the distribution, it's free, and when you invoke it, you can just simply type Mongo at the command line in your bash shell, and you'll be moved from the bash shell into the Mongo shell. By default, when you type in the word Mongo at the command line, what you're really doing is telling Mongo I want to connect to my localhost Mongo instance running at the default port of 27017. Once you connect, as you can see in the little blurb, in the little screenshot on the presentation, right here, once you connect, and I did using not the default port, I actually connected to our sharded cluster, then right away you can see I'm giving some commands to the shell. Here, the first command that I'm giving is the db command, and that tells Mongo to display the current database that I'm in. By default, when you log into Mongo, you're connected to a test database. If I want to see all the databases that are available within the sharded cluster, I use the show DBs command. And that tells me I've got several databases. And then if I want to switch to the database, I use the use space and the name of the database. And now I'll be switched to the test DB. And then I can do a show tables to see what tables are stored in that database. And if you're coming from a MySQL world, you'll realize that this is very similar to MySQL, except MySQL requires you to spell things out like show databases. But otherwise, everything's pretty much the same. Okay. The shell itself has shortcuts, just like the bash shell does. So the typical usage, the default usage, is when you give a command, you want to say the username and password, because you do have security features implemented that we talked about in a previous video, right? But it is optional. You can actually run Mongo out of the box with no user authentication account set up. And of course, remember, that is changing. I believe, did change, I believe, in version 3.6. You have to have a user and password by default. But anyway, you can also override the default host, or you can override the default port. You can do one, the other, or both. And then Mongo also provides a short name to spare us angst in our fingers from typing so much. And you can see the short form at the bottom, -u for user, -p for pass, and -h for the host. There is no alias or short form for the port. You still have to type that in. Also notice, too, that the short form uses single hyphens, whereas the long form uses double hyphens, which is also very similar to most commands in the Unix shell. Okay. Also, I'm surprised constantly at the number of developers that don't know about the Mongo RC file. And the Mongo RC file, by default, is stored in your home directory the first time you use Mongo shell. And it creates what we call a hidden file because it begins with a dot. So in your home directory, there's a .mongorc.js. It's a JavaScript file. And you can store JavaScript snippets into that file, like the one I have on your screen. And what that does is every time you power up the Mongo shell, the Mongo shell will read this run command file and will integrate that run command file into the shell so that you can reference these commands that you've added in JavaScript from the command line. So for example, this turns on the pretty command for all find queries, and we'll talk about that in the next video. And the next command, the unpretty command, turns it off. So if you want to disable that pretty print functionality that Mongo has, that's the second function, is the unpretty function is the function will do that. By default, Mongo, I guess you could call it, does unpretty on its data format. In other words, if you grab a record out of the database, as we've seen in the past, Mongo tries to display the record on one line, whereas a pretty print format breaks everything out with tabs and indexes and one key value pair per line. Anyways, to bypass that RC file, you would use the --no RC option when you start the Mongo shell. Always a good idea to do that in a production system. Okay,